Hello my dears, and welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon, and tonight I've got another book talk video to share with you guys. And tonight we are talking about a recent anthology that I read that I absolutely loved, and that is Why I Love Horror. And basically what we have here is a collection of essays from a bunch of really heavy-hitting horror authors currently working and putting out exceptional work. And I had been excited for this one ever since I heard when it was announced. And so I finally got around to reading it, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Now, normally the format for book talks is I give you like a brief synopsis, and then we move into the spoilers. But of course, with really short pieces of work like essays, we're not going to do that for every single essay. Plus, I don't want to ruin them for you right off the jump. But the spoiler section is, I'm going to be going into the one story that was the top, one essay that was the top essay for me. And then after that, I'm going to talk about why I love horror, what got me into it, and share a bit of that with you guys. So stick around for that if you're interested. So this collection has a bunch of authors, a lot of whom I've read books from, and then some that I hadn't. Like at the beginning were Brian Keene and Haley Piper, and I haven't read from either of those authors. Their stories were more like how creatures for one, I think it was Haley's Godzilla was like what really captured her attention when she was a kid. And then for Brian, it was more like comic books and things like that. And I enjoyed those. But as the volume moved on through the essays, I feel like they got a little deeper, and that's where it really got its claws into me. So just off the top of my head, here are some of the contributors to this volume, aside from those two just mentioned. There's also Alma Katsu, Tananarive, Gabino Iglesias, Clay McLeod Chapman, Paul Tremblay, Grady Hendrix, Stephen Graham Jones. Who else? Victor Laval. Just so many heavy hitters. Some of the standout essays for me. One is Alma Katsu's, and it's interesting. She writes about how real life horror is what drew her to horror, and how she used to work for a top tier government agency with 3 letters in the name, and how she used to do analysis on atrocities like genocides and things like that in the 90s, and how horror kind of became a balm to her soul while dealing with that. And then Tananarive, I really loved her essay as well, in that she talks about the social horrors, like talking about the first thing she mentions is her great-grandmother dying. Seeing that up close and personal really made her feel her own mortality as a very young child, and that terrified her. And then it moves on to the social horrors of her parents. Both her parents were big time involved activists in social rights movements. And it got to the point, there's one point where she mentions when her family moves to Miami, her father, I think, was getting death threats because of his activism work. And it was so bad that it inspired a group of white people from their church to take turns keeping watch over their house at night to make sure that they were okay and nothing bad happened to them. Which, what a beautiful thing, but oh my God, like that's crazy that it was that scary. They felt they needed to do that. Then we had Gabino's, and I really liked his as well. He talks about his Hispanic upbringing, and like how at his grandmother's house there were 2 bathrooms in the house, one in the main bedroom and one in the hallway, but the one in the hallway was kind of reserved for ghosts. And so every human that came into the house had to use the bathroom in the bedroom. And I loved that. I loved that so much. I love when other cultures talk about their traditions and their superstitions and things like that, and I loved that. And then he goes on to talk about how when he was a little older and he'd get scared, he'd make rules for himself to keep himself safe. And I really, really, really relate to that. I did that all the time. When I was like 8 or 9 years old, I was very afraid of house fires for some reason, even though I'd never been in one, never knew anyone. Well, that's not true. When my mom was little, her family had a house fire. So I knew that, but other than that, I had no reason to constantly be afraid of house fires. So I had this thing in my mind where if I packed a bag every night before bed and put it by the bed, the house wouldn't catch fire. And I did that for months. Anyway, so I get the making the rules to keep yourself safe feeling. Loved that story. After that, what else? What other ones were some standouts? Paul Tremblay's was great. It's kind of a series of vignettes about why he loves horror. I liked that a lot. Josh Mallerman's was really good too. He's on a train traveling, and there's a young man sitting across from him, a very serious looking young man, an academic type, and that man sees he's reading Psycho 2, and they begin to have a conversation, and the man really looks down as an intellectual. He really looks down at the horror genre in general, and Josh kind of has a conversation with him about the ways that horror can move and save and change you, and I really like that one as well. Then Rachel Harrison had one in there. Love her too. I saw the blurb, because before each essay there was a blurb by the editor kind of telling you a bit about the writer in case you were unfamiliar. And they referred to her, I think, as like the millennial queen of horror, something like that. And that's so true. If you haven't checked out Rachel Harrison, would definitely recommend. Anyway, hers was kind of about the horrors of being a woman. Especially, it starts off like when she's a young woman, and like diet culture in the 90s and the early 2000s, and just carrying it up on through to present day in all the ways that all the horrors women have to face in their day-to-day lives. And at one point she mentions that she has never felt safe in her own body, and then she says it is a haunted house. And that line, wow, that was a powerful line. Loved it. Then we had Grady Hendrix. This one was the number one standout in this collection for me. Grady, as you know, if you've been around my channel for a while, he's a favorite author of mine, top 3 for sure. He never misses, and this story begins with such a punch to your face, and it doesn't let go. And it's about his father. And I'll get more into it in the spoiler section. But it's about having a father, having a man in your house that you don't know. You know nothing about, and how scary that is. Loved it. And then the collection finishes off with Stephen Graham Jones in the most, Stephen Graham Jones way possible. Like Paul Tremblay's, it's kind of a series of vignettes into his experience with horror. And I love that one too, because his is just called Why Horror, and then the first section says, because I love eating ketchup. And that had me. I was like, okay, what do you mean? And it was just great. It was great. But yeah, like I said, that Grady Jones one, or Grady Jones, I'm merging them together. Grady Hendrix one was a real standout. So now we're going to get into I'm going to just talk a bit more in depth about that one. So if you don't want to hear about this one in particular, you can skip to the next part where I talk about my connection and love of horror. So scram. Anyway, the book starts off, the essay starts off with Grady saying that I wish I had the actual line in front of me, but it's like, my father kept the severed arm of a child in his freezer. And you're like, what? What do you mean? And it goes on, and he's talking about this severed arm in his father's freezer. And then we're just learning more about his home life. His dad was a cardiologist, and he'd oftentimes come home covered in blood. Eventually, his grandmother lives with him, and she has Alzheimer's. And one night, he's home alone with her, and she's knocking on this wooden table, and he's like, what do you want? What do you need? And she says, I know where Grady goes. I know where Grady goes in the night. And then the next line is, me and my father are both named Grady. So you're like, what does she know about your father? And clearly that was something that perplexed him as well. We learn about how his father used to like to take pictures, but he'd take really weird pictures, really off-putting pictures of like an empty hotel room, the back of people's heads, a bench, things like that. And when his father comes for his graduation, after he leaves, he sends pictures. And one of them is of an empty hotel room, but there's a body on the bed he sees, fully covered in a blanket, arm dangling off. He's like, what is that? So, of course, the insinuation is there between the arm and the blood and the body that his father's a serial killer. But then you get to this part towards the end of the story where he talks about this woman that used to carpool him and a bunch of his classmates to school when they were in the first grade, I think, and she used to tell stories, ghost stories, to try to keep this gaggle of boys entertained for the car ride. And when they'd get there to the destination, they'd all say, is this true? Is it true? Is this a true story? And she'd say, maybe. So then it kind of moves into Grady talking about what he's just told us. And he says, is all that true? Maybe. Maybe some of it's true. Maybe this part's true to make the rest of it fit. But what's for sure true is that I lived with a man who I didn't know. And I was scared by it. And it's an incredible essay. And in the blurb before the essay, the editor talks about how his father is something Grady never talks or writes about. And that the essay coming up is a little darker, a little more disturbing than the other ones. And it was so good. So good. And I loved it. Grady, you and Stephen Graham Jones, you never miss for me. And this was a fantastic collection. I would highly recommend. I find it so hard to give a star rating to anthologies, especially one like this where they're very personal, they're essays about their life's experience, and so that's tough to, but it's going to be 5 stars because they were all so good. I've added a bunch of authors that I haven't read before to my TBR thanks to reading their essays in this, like Victor Laval. I haven't read from him before. I definitely look forward to it. Omakatsu, I've read short stories from before, but adding her novels to my list. I want to read more Tananarive Due. The only one I've read is The Reformatory, which was excellent. So it's just great. If you're new to horror, I would recommend reading this. Or if you're curious about horror, but you're not quite, you don't really read it, but you're curious about it, and you want to hear these authors talk about why they write it, why it soothes them, why it comforts them. This is an excellent collection for that. So, would recommend. Let me know in the comments if you've read it and what you thought, and what was your favorite essay. You don't have, if you can't remember the title, just the author, because I can't remember the titles. Except for Stevens, which was Why Horror. So, anyway, now for a little bit, I just want to share with you a little bit of my horror education, as it were. It started when I was little. And reading in general, we moved around a lot. And with things ever changing, schools, friends, homes, books were constant. You could control that. You want to read as much as you want to read. You want to control how much you're consuming, you can. And as a little kid, that's one of the only things you can control, So I read a lot. And then when I was probably, I'd say 10 probably, the local library in the town that I lived in, which had the librarian, whose name was Diane, who was incredible. She would put books aside that she thought I would like. I think about her all the time. Anyway, I started reading R.L. Stine first, then Christopher Pike, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, all those stories. I loved the way my heart would race. I would get so scared I'd have to slam the book shut and throw it on the floor when I'd be reading in bed. I'd be so scared. But what a fun feeling. that adrenaline rush, even as you're laying in bed with your eyes closed, or you got to open the door just to let the hall light come in because you're so terrified. That's a feeling I chase as an adult reading horror. Because, you get older, you get, I guess, desensitized in that same way. Like, things will still scare me, disturb me, things like that. But that heart-pounding terror that I had as a kid, when I find that as an adult, it's incredible. And it's why my favorites have become my favorites, because they can deliver me those feelings. So I loved reading it as a kid. Then, once you get a little older, 11, 12, then Stephen King comes into the picture, and then you're done for. You're done for. You're hooked for life. And so I kept going, kept reading. Then I remember when I got a little older in high school, and friends of mine were reading Margaret Atwood and more literary fiction. I read those too, and I loved them, but they didn't have that same sort of heart-pounding joy that comes from horror. And then I became a mom in my early 20s, and then I didn't read as much anymore. I didn't have as much time. But then as my daughter got older, I went back to reading, and I started with like thrillers and literary fiction. But then, like an old friend knocking at my door, horror came back into my life in the form of the favorites I have now. Paul Tremblay, Grady Hendrix, Stephen Graham Jones, my favorite, and Josh Mallerman. A lot of the authors in this collection, Katrina Ward, Rachel Harrison, and I got that love flowing through my veins again for horror, and it's stuck with me since then. And yeah, it's just, there's something about horror that lets you examine the pain of life in a really spread out to the bones way. You're able to look at it and pull it apart, and I think that's beautiful. Because it can help you work through your own feelings. And perhaps that's why I'm so drawn to grief horror. Stephen Graham Jones writes it. Even in unexpected places and unexpected ways. That's what first connected me to him in the deepest way. What really sunk his claws into me was Mapping the Interior. I'd liked him before. Mapping the Interior, oh boy. If you haven't read that, I recommend it. It's like a 100-page novella. It's so good. And I've got Monstrilio on my shelf now, which I know is grief horror, and I keep putting it off, and I don't know why. Maybe I'm not quite ready to go there at this moment. But I'll be ready soon. And it's just, grief is a messy and painful and especially I feel like in Western society, we're taught to keep it simmered, keep it down. Whereas I in other cultures, I feel like they're allowed to grieve out loud more. Whereas we are told to keep it in. And in grief horror, you're allowed to pour it all out. To scream and cry and pull your hair and beat your fists. And there's something so cathartic about reading that for me. So there you go. That's gonna do it for me for tonight, I think. I think that's also why I love haunted house stories. There's something about a home being haunted. There's something about it that knocks on something very personal and true for me. And it's what scares me the most. And I think that's something left over from childhood. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I will see you again really soon with another video. And let me know if you've read this book, and let me know what's your favorite subgenre of horror. And yeah, I'll see you soon. Bye.